Chapter 1. The Empire Before the Empire. Before Julius Caesar marched across the Rubicon, before Augustus was crowned beneath the laurels, before the roar of the Colosseum echoed across 7 hills, there was another Rome, a shadow Rome. One without a name in most schoolbooks, one that spoke a language no one today can read fluently, built cities that modern archaeologists are still unearthing, and performed rituals that would chill the bones of any modern observer. Imagine a time when the gods demanded blood, and the sky itself was red like scripture, when thunder was a message, and a sacrificed liver held more political weight than a speech in the forum. This was the world of the Etruscans, a people who ruled the heart of Italy long before Rome was even a whisper. And yet, they vanished, quietly, tragically, almost surgically cut from memory. How can a civilization that shaped Roman religion, architecture, politics, and even fashion simply disappear from history? How can the blueprint for one of the greatest empires the world has ever known be forgotten by the very empire it birthed? You may never have heard of them, but once they were powerful. Once they ruled from the mountains of Tuscany to the shores of Campania. Once their kings wore purple and ruled Rome itself. In this journey through fog and fire, we will uncover who the Etruscans really were, where they came from, what they believed, how they lived, and why they vanished. Because to understand Rome, we must first understand what came before it. And as we peel back the layers of time, remember, every great empire is built on the bones of another. So subscribe to the Unveiled Past, and let the echoes of forgotten empires guide you through the silence they left behind. Let us begin. Chapter 2. Land of Smoke, Bronze, and Blood. Imagine standing on a rugged hill in ancient Tuscany, some 3,000 years ago. The air smells of smoke, not from war, but from sacred fires. The sky above you is immense, streaked with the last embers of sunset. Below your feet, the earth is warm, not from the sun, but from the furnaces churning molten bronze into weapons, jewelry, and idols of gods long forgotten. You are in Etruria, and the world is young. But who were the Etruscans? Where did they come from? And why does no one seem to agree on their origins? It's one of history's great enigmas, a people so advanced in art, architecture, metallurgy, urbanism, and religion, yet whose beginnings remain cloaked in mystery. Ancient historians couldn't agree, and modern scholars still debate the question today. Herodotus claimed they came from Lydia, in Anatolia, sailing across the sea to escape famine. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, on the other hand, believed they were native Italians, a people sprung from the soil of the peninsula itself. Linguistic evidence, confusing. Archaeological records, fragmented. Genetic studies, inconclusive. The truth, buried in time. And yet somehow, this ambiguity only deepens the fascination. Because the Etruscans didn't just appear, they emerged like smoke from a fire already burning. Around the year 1000 BCE, a culture known as the Villanovans began to rise in central Italy. These were not mere peasants. They cremated their dead and buried them in sophisticated urns shaped like homes, a striking vision of the afterlife. They crafted weapons and ornaments of bronze, and they built settlements on hilltops, guarded not by chance but by design. By the 8th century BCE, something changed. Those settlements became cities. The urns became elaborate tombs, bronze became gold, and the Villanovans became the Etruscans. But their cities weren't scattered huts in the wilderness. They were organized, complex, and interconnected. This was a world of trade routes, of shared religious calendars, of leagues and federations. Cities like Vincae, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri rose with monumental architecture, temples carved from volcanic tuff, and necropolises that rivaled the grandeur of their living quarters. They built roads, not Roman roads, but the ones Rome would later copy. They constructed drainage systems, walled fortresses, aqueducts. Their urban design reveals a people who understood not just survival, but permanence. And where there is permanence, there is identity. The Etruscans did not see themselves as a single empire. They were a constellation of city-states, each ruled by a leucomon, a kind of sacred king-priest, and bound by common language, religion, and ritual. Like the Greeks, they shared gods with different names. Like the Phoenicians, they traded across the sea. But unlike their neighbors, the Etruscans viewed life and death through a unique spiritual lens, one that placed enormous importance on divination, destiny, and the will of the heavens. Their language, still largely undeciphered. What we know comes from thousands of inscriptions on tombs, mirrors, jewelry, and temples. It's not Indo-European, it doesn't behave like Latin or Greek. It is alien, elegant, and eerily silent. as if the Etruscans spoke in a tongue meant only for the gods. And yet, from that silence, echoes emerge. Because the Etruscans were not just priests and builders, they were also artists, masters of bronze and terracotta, painters of lavish tombs that still survive today. Their murals show banquets, dancers, musicians, charioteers, scenes of joy, of movement, of life. But look closer and you'll see shadows, hints of the underworld, winged demons, figures half human, half divine. This was not simple decoration, it was theology. A worldview where death was not an end, but a journey. A realm ruled by dark deities, watched over by terrifying guardians like Charoon, a blue-skinned ferryman with a hammer, and Vanth, a winged guide of souls. What kind of people imagined such beings? What kind of world gave birth to them? Let's return to the hills of Etruria. Around you, the world is changing. Greeks are establishing colonies in southern Italy. Phoenicians trade along the coast. The Etruscans do not hide from this. They embrace it. They become maritime merchants, feared pirates, and cunning diplomats. Their ships sail to Sardinia, Corsica, Carthage, even the Greek world. They export iron, silver, ceramics. They import luxury goods, and more dangerously, ideas. And yet, through it all, they remain distinct. While the Greeks wrote myths, the Etruscans practiced ritual. Where the Greeks questioned the cosmos, the Etruscans interpreted it. They believed that every lightning strike, every flight of birds, every shape of a sheep's liver was a divine message. Their priests, the haruspices, trained for decades to read these signs. Rome would later adopt the practice, but it began here, in the land of smoke, bronze, and blood. And the blood was real. The Etruscans did not shy from violence. Their tomb paintings show gladiatorial games, long before Rome made them infamous. But these were not mere entertainments. They were offerings. Blood spilled not for sport, but for the gods. The combat was sacred, the death symbolic. Life, after all, was fragile, and the gods always watching. By the 6th century BCE, Etruscan power reached its zenith. Their influence stretched from the Po Valley to Naples. Rome, still a young city, was under Etruscan rule. Kings with Etruscan names, like Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, sat on the Roman throne. The symbols of Roman power, the fasces, the purple toga, the curule chair, were all Etruscan in origin. The line between Rome and Etruria was never sharp. It was blurred, intimate, and ultimately dangerous. Because while Rome absorbed Etruscan culture, it also plotted its escape. But we are not there yet. For now we stand in the golden age of a civilization that defies easy categorization. They were not an empire in the Roman sense, no legions, no universal law, but they were powerful, sophisticated, mysterious. And they left behind a world rich in meaning and wrapped in silence. Archaeologists today still uncover their treasures: bronze mirrors etched with myth, sarcophagi shaped like reclining nobles, urns filled with the ashes of those long gone. Every artifact whispers of a people who saw life and death as a sacred continuum, and who believed, perhaps, that memory itself was a form of immortality. But memory is fragile, and history is cruel. So how did it all disappear? We'll begin to answer that in the next chapter, as we descend deeper into the Etruscan soul, a world where gods demanded fear, temples touched the sky, and death was only the beginning. Because in order to truly understand the living, we must follow the path of the dead. Chapter 3. The gods who drank blood. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world without absolutes. A world where the gods do not love you, they tolerate you. A world where salvation is not a promise, but a gamble. Now open your eyes again and find yourself in the shadowed temples of ancient Etruria, where religion wasn't a matter of hope, but of fear. The Etruscans didn't merely believe in the gods, they negotiated with them. Their deities were not benevolent creators, nor moral judges, they were cosmic forces, ancient, unpredictable, and often terrifying. And to live among them was to walk on the edge of a knife. Where did this theology come from? No one knows for certain, but it shaped every moment of Etruscan life, from birth to death, from farming to warfare. And at the center of it all stood the sacred art of divination, the reading of signs, the decoding of the god's will. Because for the Etruscans, the universe spoke constantly. The question was, would you listen? They had a word for it, Disciplina Etrusca, a body of sacred knowledge said to have been revealed by a supernatural child born from the earth, the Tages, who rose from a plowed field and began to teach the secrets of the cosmos. He looked like a child, but spoke with the wisdom of an old god. And from his mouth came a system of theology so complex, so obsessive, that even the Romans centuries later couldn't let it go. The Etruscans believed that every moment in time, every action, every thunderclap or flight of birds was a message. The haruspices, priest diviners, would study the entrails of sacrificed animals, especially the liver, thought to be the seat of life and destiny. They memorized every fold, every cavity, every vein. A bronze model known as the liver of Piacenza survives to this day, like a map of divine geography, the cosmos inscribed in meat. But it didn't end there. They also practiced augury, the observation of birds, their direction, their number, their flight patterns. The gods, it was believed, spoke through wings. A flock flying east was not just a coincidence, it was a command. Decisions of war and peace, of kingship and sacrifice, were made based on these signs. And the gods who sent them, they were legion. At the top was Tinia, the sky god, bearer of thunderbolts. Then Uni, his consort, a goddess of both protection and vengeance. Minerva, goddess of wisdom and war, later absorbed by Rome as Minerva. But these were just the upper tier. Beneath them, the Dii Involuti, the veiled gods. Silent, nameless, unknowable, not even the other gods could oppose them. They were fate itself, and to anger them was to invite catastrophe. This was not religion as comfort, this was religion as strategy. Life was a contract with unseen forces, and ritual was your only leverage. Fail to appease the gods, you'd lose your crops, your battle, your children. And when tragedy came, as it often did, the blood began to flow. Yes, the Etruscans practiced human sacrifice, rarely, but meaningfully. During crises, it was said that a life must be given to the underworld to appease its lords. Tomb paintings show bound captives, blade in hand, as offerings. Other images show gladiators in mortal combat, not for entertainment but as a sacred rite, the shedding of blood as a substitute for war. It may horrify us, but for the Etruscans, it was balance. The gods had given life, and they could demand it back. Even in death, their rituals were elaborate. The Etruscans did not bury their dead in silence. They built entire necropolis, cities of the dead, with tombs carved like homes, walls painted with feasts, dances, and music. As if death were not an ending, but an invitation to the ultimate banquet. The tomb was a house. The journey continued. But the journey wasn't safe. Because the underworld, or Aita, as they called it, was no peaceful haven. It was a dangerous realm, guarded by monstrous figures. Chief among them was Charun, the ferryman, not the quiet old man of Greek myth, but a blue-skinned demon with hooked nose and hammer in hand. He didn't guide you, he dragged you. Then there was Vanth, a winged figure, sometimes benevolent, sometimes deadly. She could be your guide, or your judge. It was never clear, and that was the point. The underworld was not black and white, it was grey, like life, like fate. What's astonishing is how much of this belief system Rome absorbed and yet rewrote. The Roman Senate kept Etruscan haruspices on staff for centuries. Their gods were rebranded, their rituals became institutions. But the fear, the existential dread, that was lost. Rome replaced the mysterious with the managerial, the sacred with the legal. And in doing so, something ancient, something raw, was buried. Today, we still uncover Etruscan tombs, each one a riddle, sarcophagi with lifelike faces, reclining as if at a feast. Inscriptions no one can fully translate, mirrors that reflect not our world but another, filled with gods, monsters, fates. And yet, we feel something in them, an echo, a chill, a presence. Because the Etruscans believed that the boundary between this world and the next was thin, frighteningly thin, and their rituals were not meant to separate life from death, but to bind them forever. So the next time you see a Roman arch, or read about a Roman triumph, or watch a gladiator fall on the sand, remember where it began. It began in the dark, with a whisper, a wingbeat, a blade, with gods who drank blood. Chapter 3, Actium's Echoes, the battle that sealed a fate. Imagine for a terrifying moment the vast expanse of the Ionian Sea, off the western coast of Greece, transformed into a colossal chessboard of death. The year is 31 BCE, two colossal forces, each representing a distinct vision for the future of the Roman world, are about to collide in a confrontation of unprecedented scale. On one side, the disciplined, meticulously organized legions and fleets of Octavian, embodying the stern, traditional values of Rome. On the other, the opulent, diverse armada of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, a powerful alliance of Roman might and Egyptian wealth, a bold challenge to the very heart of the Republic. This was the Battle of Actium, a naval engagement that wasn't just a clash of ships, but a pivotal moment that would seal the fate of a queen, an empire, and an entire ancient civilization. Did you ever wonder how one single battle could reshape the course of history so dramatically? Actium was more than a skirmish. It was the culmination of years of political maneuvering, propaganda, and simmering resentments. Octavian had meticulously demonized Antony, painting him as a slave to Cleopatra's will, a Roman hero corrupted by Eastern decadence. The stakes were incredibly high. The winner would emerge as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The loser would face utter annihilation. The stage was set, a natural amphitheater of conflict. Antony, advised by Cleopatra, had chosen the Gulf of Actium, a seemingly defensible position. His forces were impressive, 500 warships, heavy and formidable, loaded with seasoned veterans. Cleopatra's Egyptian fleet, 60 swift and maneuverable vessels, were laden with the gold reserves of Egypt, ready to fund the war, or perhaps, as some whispered, to facilitate an escape. On land, nearly 100,000 legionaries awaited, but their position was problematic. A plague had swept through their camp, and desertions were mounting as Octavian's propaganda took its toll. Octavian, on the other hand, commanded a slightly smaller but far more agile fleet, led by his brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa understood naval warfare with a genius that was almost clairvoyant. His ships were lighter, faster, designed for maneuverability and quick attacks, precisely what was needed to counter Antony's massive but cumbersome vessels. Octavian's legions on land were well supplied and highly motivated, fueled by the narrative of a righteous war against a foreign threat. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, dawned, a day heavy with destiny. The wind was against Antony's fleet, pinning them inside the Gulf. When the wind finally shifted mid-morning, Antony saw his chance. His heavy ships lumbered out, their goal to grapple with Octavian's lighter vessels and engage in a land battle on the sea, where his legionaries could overwhelm the enemy. But Agrippa was too cunning. He kept his ships at a distance, darting in and out, ramming and withdrawing, avoiding the direct assault Antony craved. It was a dance of death, slow and agonizing for Antony's forces. Imagine the chaos, the splintering wood, the cries of men, the clang of metal, the acrid smell of burning pitch. Antony's heavy ships, designed to smash and board, were struggling to land a decisive blow. They were too slow to maneuver, too ponderous to evade Agrippa's swift attacks. It was a grueling, hours-long stalemate, a brutal test of endurance for both sides. And then, a moment that has been debated by historians for millennia, a turning point shrouded in controversy. At the height of the battle, with the outcome still uncertain, Cleopatra's 60 Egyptian ships, strategically placed behind Antony's main line, raised their sails and against all expectations fled the battle, cutting through the Roman lines and heading south towards Egypt. Was it pre-planned? A desperate attempt to salvage her treasury and escape to fight another day? Or was it a sudden panicked retreat? The Roman historians, writing under Octavian's patronage, painted it as a cowardly desertion, an act of treachery by the foreign queen. Antony, seeing her departure, inexplicably broke formation, boarded a fast ship and followed her. His generals and soldiers were left stunned, abandoned on the battlefield. This act, whether premeditated or a moment of fatal impulse, shattered the morale of Antony's remaining forces. Imagine the despair of the soldiers, seeing their commander abandon them, their queen fleeing with the treasury, the fight drained out of them. Though some resisted fiercely, the outcome was now inevitable. Octavian's forces pressed their advantage, trapping the leaderless ships. By the end of the day, Antony's fleet was either captured or destroyed. His land forces, hearing of his flight, surrendered to Octavian days later. The echoes of Actium reverberated across the Mediterranean. This single battle wasn't just a military defeat, it was a political earthquake. It consolidated Octavian's power in a way no previous victory had. It branded Antony as a traitor, a man who had abandoned his men and his honor for a foreign queen. And for Cleopatra, it was the beginning of the end. The dream of a unified Hellenistic empire, of Egypt standing as an equal to Rome, was shattered irrevocably. They fled back to Egypt, Cleopatra speeding ahead, Antony following days later, utterly broken. But even in their despair, in the knowledge that their world was collapsing around them, they attempted to rally, to prepare for the inevitable Roman invasion. They knew Octavian would not rest until they were both eliminated. Actium was not merely a battle, it was a judgment, a clear declaration that Rome, under Octavian, would tolerate no rivals, no alternative visions. The independent kingdom of Egypt, a legacy spanning thousands of years, was now truly doomed. The stage was set for the final tragic act of Cleopatra's desperate struggle, a struggle that had now become a race against the very forces of time and destiny. Chapter 4: The Lover's Last Stand. Despair in Alexandria. Imagine the air of Alexandria, once vibrant with the echoes of philosophers and the laughter of queens, now heavy with a palpable sense of doom. After the catastrophic defeat at Actium, Mark Antony and Cleopatra returned to their magnificent city, but the triumphant procession was replaced by a grim, desperate retreat. Their world, once seemingly limitless, had shrunk to the confines of their palace walls, besieged not just by Octavian's advancing legions, but by the relentless weight of their own despair. Have you ever witnessed hope slowly bleed out, leaving only the cold ashes of inevitability? That was the reality for Antony and Cleopatra in those final, agonizing months. Antony, once the charismatic, larger-than-all-life general, was a broken man. The shame of his flight from Actium, the abandonment of his legions, gnawed at his very soul. He plunged into a spiral of self-destruction, building a society of friends he mockingly called the inimitable livers, dedicated to extravagant feasting and reckless abandon, a desperate attempt to drown out the echoes of defeat. It was a macabre masquerade, a dance of death. Cleopatra, however, was a survivor. Even in the face of utter ruin, her mind was still racing, desperately seeking an escape, a final gambit. She understood that Alexandria was doomed. Her gaze turned east, to lands beyond Rome's immediate grasp. Could she escape with her vast wealth? Perhaps to India, to build a new kingdom, a new future? She began to make preparations, dragging ships overland from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, an audacious plan that spoke volumes of her enduring will, even as everything crumbled around her. But the vast machinery of Rome, set in motion by Octavian, was inexorable. His legions were marching. His propaganda had solidified his position as the undisputed master of the West. There was no escaping the final reckoning. Consider the psychological toll of such a siege. Every day, the news from the outside grew grimmer. Allies deserted them. Kings and rulers who had once paid homage now flocked to Octavian, eager to secure their own positions in the new order. The desertion of their own fleet, the very sailors who had served them for years, was a particularly bitter blow. Imagine the betrayal, the chilling realization that even those sworn to protect you would abandon you when faced with overwhelming power. It was a stark reminder that loyalty, in the face of absolute domination, is a fragile thing. Antony, in moments of lucidity, would attempt to rouse his remaining forces, to instill some semblance of hope. He would train soldiers, prepare defenses, and even launch small, desperate sorties against Octavian's advance guard. These were the last flickers of his former glory, flashes of the mighty general who had once held half the Roman world in his grasp. But these efforts were futile, acts of defiance against an unyielding tide. His despair was too deep, his spirit too broken. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was preparing for the ultimate betrayal, her own death. She experimented with various poisons on condemned prisoners, seeking a swift, painless end, a method that would preserve her dignity in the face of inevitable capture. She studied asps and other venomous creatures, determined to find a way to escape Octavian's grand triumph, to deny him the spectacle of leading her, a captive queen, through the streets of Rome. This wasn't just a morbid obsession, it was an act of profound political will, a final assertion of control in a world where all control had been stripped away. The summer of 30 BCE arrived, hot and oppressive, mirroring the suffocating pressure on Alexandria. Octavian's forces reached the city walls. The final act had begun. Antony, in a final desperate spasm of military action, launched a last valiant attack on Octavian's cavalry outside the city. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed like the old Antony was back. His troops achieved a minor victory, driving back the Roman horsemen. The Alexandrians cheered, hope flickering in their hearts. Antony, invigorated, returned to Cleopatra, embracing her, celebrating this small triumph. But that brief moment of exultation was brutally short-lived. The next day, when Antony ordered his fleet to engage Octavian's ships, his navy, the very men he had once commanded, rowed out to meet the enemy, and then, in a devastating act of treason, dipped their oars in salute to Octavian's forces, joining them without a fight. Imagine the horror, the utter disbelief as Antony watched his own fleet turn against him. It was the final, crushing blow. Antony's land forces, seeing the betrayal of the navy, lost all will to fight. They deserted en masse, or simply surrendered. Antony, humiliated, disgraced, and utterly defeated, retreated to the palace, abandoning all hope. And then came the cruelest deception. Cleopatra, in a desperate attempt to save herself, or perhaps to simply avoid Antony's wrath, barricaded herself in a monument she had constructed near the temple of Isis, spreading a rumor that she had taken her own life. When Antony heard the news, his world shattered completely. "What are you waiting for, Antony?" his loyal servant Eros is said to have asked, "You have nothing left to live for." Antony, in a final act that echoed the grand tragedy he had become, attempted to fall on his own sword, but his hand trembled, his resolve failed him. His servant Eros, true to his word, took the blade and ended his own life instead. Antony, wounded but still alive, pleaded for his servants to finish him. Instead, he was carried, bleeding, to Cleopatra's monument. Imagine this poignant, terrible scene. Cleopatra, fearful of opening the sealed doors to the Romans, pulled Antony up into the monument through a window with ropes. With his dying breath, in the arms of the woman for whom he had sacrificed an empire, Mark Antony finally succumbed to his wounds. The great triumvir, the charismatic general who had shared power with Caesar and Octavian, died not in battle, but in a final, agonizing act of despair and betrayal. His death marked the true end of the Roman civil wars and left Octavian as the undisputed master of the Roman world. For Cleopatra, the death of Antony was not just a personal tragedy, it was the removal of her last protector, her last hope. The Roman shadow had finally enveloped Alexandria. She was now utterly alone, a queen without a kingdom, awaiting the inevitable arrival of her conqueror, a man determined to parade her as a trophy, a stark symbol of Rome's ultimate triumph. The defiant serpent of the Nile was trapped, her desperate gambit now irrevocably lost. Chapter 5. A Captive Queen. The Price of Defiance. Imagine the chilling silence that falls after a storm of war, when the last cries of battle fade, replaced only by the solemn march of the victors. For Cleopatra, the sound of Octavian's legions entering Alexandria was not a roar, but a death knell. Her beloved city, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, was now a conquered prize, and she, the last pharaoh, the queen of kings, was nothing more than a captive, awaiting the grim fate designed for her by the cold, calculating mind of her conqueror. Have you ever considered the crushing weight of absolute defeat? To go from ruling an empire to being a prisoner, with your every move watched, your future determined by the whim of your enemy. This was Cleopatra's new reality. After Antony's agonizing death, she remained secluded in her monument, but her defiance was a fragile shield. Octavian's men, led by his trusted officer Proculius, finally gained entry. Imagine the scene: the last independent queen of Egypt, surrounded by Roman soldiers, her royal dignity intact but her power utterly vanished. Octavian's orders were clear: capture her alive. He had a grand vision for her. He wanted to parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, a living symbol of his ultimate victory, the definitive proof that the East had been subdued and that his rival Mark Antony had truly been vanquished by the irresistible force of Roman might. He didn't want a dead queen, he wanted a spectacle, a crowning jewel for his monumental achievement. But Cleopatra, even in captivity, was no ordinary woman. She knew the Roman game. She understood the humiliation that awaited her. For a queen of her stature, raised in the opulent traditions of the Ptolemies, to be dragged through the streets of Rome, bound in chains, jeered at by the very populace who had once viewed her with fear and fascination, was a fate worse than death. It was the ultimate desecration of her royal person, the final, unforgivable insult to her ancient lineage. She still had one weapon left: her mind, and she used it with a desperate cunning that, even in retrospect, commands a certain awe. When Octavian arrived in Alexandria, he demanded to see her. Imagine their first encounter: the young, stoic Roman victor, having just crushed her world, facing the legendary queen who had seduced his great-uncle and his rival. What passed between them in that meeting? Octavian, ever the pragmatist, probably expected a broken woman, begging for mercy. What he encountered was a monarch who, despite her circumstances, still possessed an uncanny ability to command. She was strategic, desperate, yet utterly composed. She attempted to charm him, to appeal to his better nature, to negotiate for her children, particularly for Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar. She presented him with lists of her treasures, attempting to distract him, to buy time, to perhaps even secure some small concession. Did she genuinely believe she could enchant him, as she had Caesar and Antony? Perhaps not, but it was a last-ditch effort, a final throw of the dice, to preserve some shred of dignity, some sliver of hope for her children's future. Octavian, however, was impervious to her charms. He was not Caesar, easily swayed by passion or intellectual intrigue. He was cold, rational, and utterly focused on his objectives. He offered vague assurances regarding her children, promises he had no intention of keeping, particularly concerning Caesarion, who represented a dangerous threat to his own legitimacy as Caesar's heir. He knew her intent: to escape the triumph, and he was determined to prevent it. He had her guarded meticulously, allowing her certain privileges, but under constant surveillance. Think about the psychological torture of that existence. Every day that passed brought her closer to that inevitable public humiliation. She was given access to her personal effect, allowed to perform rituals, even to visit Antony's tomb. These seemingly generous gestures were, in fact, subtle traps designed to keep her calm, to make her believe she still had some agency, all while the net tightened around her. She was a bird in a gilded cage, observed, analyzed, waiting for the moment of her final display. The legends tell us that during this period, she requested an asper, a venomous snake, from her servants. Was this a desperate act of suicide, or was it a final, defiant act of protest? We'll delve deeper into the specifics of her death in the next chapter. But here, in her captivity, the idea of death, particularly a self-inflicted death, became her ultimate tool of resistance. To die on her own terms, to deny Octavian the triumph he so craved, would be her final greatest victory. This was the ultimate price of defiance. Cleopatra had challenged Rome, not with legions alone, but with her very existence, her intellect, her charisma, her vision of an Eastern power, and Rome, through Octavian, demanded absolute submission. Her capture was not just a military victory, it was a symbolic conquering, a ritualistic breaking of the last great independent Hellenistic monarch. The days stretched into weeks, each one a torment. Her loyal attendants, Charmian and Eros, remained by her side, witnessing her agony, understanding the terrible choice she faced. The Roman guards, meticulous in their duty, watched her every move, ensuring their master's prize would not slip through his fingers. Yet, even under such scrutiny, the Queen of Egypt was planning her last, most audacious escape, not from Alexandria, not from Rome, but from the very clutches of Octavian's grand design. She knew she could not win the war, but she could win the last battle for her dignity, for her legacy. The stage was set for a final, mysterious act, one that would cement her legend even as it ended her life. Chapter 4: Tombs that breathe, cities that remember. To wander through an Etruscan necropolis is not to walk among the dead, it is to walk through a city built for the dead, where every tomb whispers, every wall paints memories, and every stone remembers a name. The Etruscans did not bury their dead in silence, they built homes, real homes for them. Chambered tombs carved from tufa rock, with sloped roofs, carved door frames, beds, chairs, even painted beams. These were not graves, these were eternal residences, reflections of life meant to shelter the soul in death. Their largest necropolises, like Cerveteri or Tarquinia, are not just burial sites, they're cities of the departed, arranged in streets, with small hills hiding lavishly decorated interiors. Step inside the tomb of the leopards, and you'll find yourself in a banquet. Men and women reclining on couches, holding cups, feasting, dancing together. In a world where Greek women stayed hidden, the Etruscans painted theirs alive, front and center, laughing beside their lovers. Death, for the Etruscans, wasn't the end, it was another chapter. The walls of the tomb were not mournful, they were alive with color, music, and memory. You didn't enter darkness, you entered narrative, and the story you told with your life would echo through generations, preserved in pigment, in symbol, in stone. But beneath the beauty lay unease. Many tombs also include figures of Vanth, again with her torch, sometimes appearing in pairs, flanking the entrance like spiritual border guards. In others, Charoon waits with his hammer. The message is clear, though this may look like a celebration, something else watches. The Etruscans knew, no joy in the afterlife is untouched by shadow. And this duality, joy and dread, feast and funeral, is what makes the Etruscans haunting. They did not hide from death, they decorated it. Even now, standing in a silent tomb painted 2,500 years ago, you don't feel alone, you feel observed. Because in their world, memory was not passive, it had eyes. Chapter 5: The Blood in the Bronze. We often romanticize ancient civilizations, their temples, their art, their mystery. But beneath the elegance of the Etruscan smile, there was blood. Their world was not only one of feasts and music, it was also of sacrifice, of sharpened bronze, of rituals soaked in fear and necessity. Etruscan religion was visceral. Gods were not distant deities to be flattered with incense alone. They demanded offerings, they demanded signs, and often the signs came in blood. The Etruscans believed that the will of the gods was written in the organs of animals, particularly in the livers of sacrificed sheep. This practice, haruspicy, became an obsession. Priests known as haruspices would inspect every curve, every vein, every discoloration of a liver and interpret divine messages, war or peace, health or plague. The liver became a divine map and fate, something you could touch. This wasn't theater, it was deadly serious. Before battles, kings would not act without these omens. Before planting crops, families waited on the reading. And this obsession with signs birthed a deep, unique class of sacred experts, men trained in the mysterious Etrusca disciplina, a lost corpus of knowledge passed down from generation to generation, believed to have been dictated by a child prophet named Predates, who emerged from freshly ploughed earth. But where there are omens, there is fear. The Etruscans believed the gods were not just to be loved, they were to be feared. The divine world was volatile. It could bring bounty, yes, but also madness, misfortune, lightning. And when the signs were unclear, or when danger approached, the Etruscans turned to more desperate measures. There are hints in art, in fragmented texts, that human sacrifices were sometimes performed, slaves offered to the gods, enemies buried with the dead, blood spilled not in rage but in devotion. In the Etruscan world, death was not only something to endure, it was something to use. And this tension, this deep undercurrent of controlled savagery, is part of what makes their civilization feel so alien, so raw. Behind their graceful bronzes and painted tombs was a society where the veil between worlds was thin, and sometimes too thin. They looked at the universe and did not see order. They saw a trembling balance, one that had to be maintained constantly through ritual, through reverence, through sacrifice. They didn't beg the gods for mercy. They tried to negotiate with them liver by liver, death by death. Chapter 6. The Banquet of the Dead. Imagine this. You're reclining on a richly embroidered couch, a golden cup in your hand, music echoing in the background. Laughter, stories, songs, everything feels alive. But this is no celebration of the present, this is a funeral. To the Etruscans, death was not an ending, but a continuation, a transition to another kind of banquet. Their tombs weren't grim stone boxes, they were homes for the dead, modeled after the living. Painted walls, wooden doors, beds, cooking utensils. Some even had carved staircases, as if the dead might go upstairs at night. And on those walls, in vivid ochres and blues, we see them, the feasts of the afterlife. Men and women reclining side by side, a shocking image to the Greeks, who found such equality scandalous, raising cups, playing lyres, dancing, not in mourning, but in celebration. Because for the Etruscans, the dead didn't vanish. They stayed, they watched, they listened. And they expected a party. The tomb was a statement. We remember you, we honor you, and we believe you're still with us. But there was a deeper reason too, one far more chilling. The Etruscans feared that if the dead were forgotten, they might become restless. The boundary between the living and the dead had to be managed with ritual and hospitality, so feasts were thrown, offerings were made, food, drink, and music were shared across realms. This was not metaphor. They truly believed in a society of the dead, a continuation of the earthly life, complete with its hierarchies, its pleasures, and its dangers. And in the deepest tombs, hidden in dark necropolises like those of Tarquinia and Cerveteri, we find a strange duality, the joyous banquet on one wall, and on the other, the dark figures of death. Winged demons, gatekeepers of the underworld. Some smile, others leer. They're not devils in the Christian sense, but they remind you, this is no place for the uninvited. The Etruscan afterlife was not heaven or hell. It was a mirror. Your social rank, your family, your fame, they followed you. Even your servants were buried with you, sometimes in horrifyingly literal ways, because in the great banquet of eternity, you still had a role to play. And so the living did everything they could to prepare the dead, dressed them in fine clothes, surrounded them with perfume bottles, food, games, jewelry. They buried them with mirrors, not just to reflect, but to guide. Because who are we really without our image? To die as an Etruscan was to enter a party that never ended, but only if you were properly remembered. Forgetfulness was the true death. Chapter 7. The Language of Silence. If you held an Etruscan inscription in your hand today, chances are you couldn't read it. Not because it's made up of mysterious symbols. In fact, the letters are eerily familiar, cousins of the Greek alphabet. You can sound them out, but you won't understand what they say. Why? Because we still don't fully understand the Etruscan language. It's not Indo-European, it's not Latin, it's not Greek, it's something older, stranger, a language that grew in parallel, perhaps echoing forgotten tongues of the Mediterranean, a voice from the shadows. And yet, the Etruscans wrote a lot, on tombs, on vases, on mirrors, on gold, linen, pottery, stone. We have thousands of inscriptions, names, dedications, formulas, but they're often short, repetitive, formulaic. No great literature has survived. No Etruscan epic, no philosophy, no sacred scripture. Just fragments, whispers. But those whispers speak volumes. One of the most mysterious artifacts is the Liber Leintius, the linen book, a funerary wrapping found in Egypt. Yes, Egypt, made of linen strips covered in Etruscan text. It's the longest Etruscan document we have, and it was only preserved because it was reused as mummy wrappings. Think about that. The key to an ancient European civilization survived in a North African tomb. Linguists have made progress. We know how to pronounce it. We can recognize patterns. Some scholars can piece together rough translations, but still, much of it remains elusive, like trying to reconstruct a dream from a single torn page. And that silence matters, because language isn't just words, it's worldview. It's how a people thinks, how they feel time, space, the divine. Without their voice, the Etruscans are ghosts, speaking through art, through ritual, through the bones of their cities. Imagine if the only remnants of our civilization were Instagram captions and street signs, but no novels, no diaries, no spoken thoughts. That's what we have with the Etruscans, form without fullness. And yet, maybe that's part of their mystique. A people so present in material, so elusive in meaning. We see their faces in sculptures, their hands raised in dances, their gods staring back at us from painted tombs, and yet we cannot hear them. The Etruscans are not entirely silent, but they speak in half sentences, in echoes, in riddles. Their language is a locked room we're still trying to enter. And maybe that's why they haunt us. Because we still don't know exactly what they were trying to say. Chapter 8. Between Worlds. Etruscan Religion and the Art of Divination. Imagine a world where every thunderclap is a message, every flight of a bird a sentence, every streak of lightning a divine whisper. That was the Etruscan universe. A reality soaked in symbols, where gods weren't distant, they were everywhere, always watching, always speaking. The Etruscans didn't merely believe in the gods, they interpreted them. Religiosity was not passive, it was an ongoing dialogue with the unseen. And at the heart of that dialogue stood one of the most distinctive features of Etruscan culture, divination. Let's talk about haruspices, a word that has echoed down into Latin, and from there into modern fantasy, but which began with the Etruscans. These were not mere priests, they were specialists in reading fate. Their sacred skill, haruspice, the art of examining the entrails of sacrificed animals, especially the liver. To us, it might sound grotesque or superstitious, but to them it was a scientific process as precise as reading a weather report. The liver was thought to be the seat of life, and its shape, color, or markings were a map of divine will. In fact, we have a bronze model from Piacenza, known as the Liver of Piacenza, covered in inscriptions and sections, like a sacred anatomical chart. It's not a prop, it was a training tool, like a pilot's flight simulator, but for prophecy. They also practiced augury, the interpretation of bird flights. The sky was divided into quadrants, and the movement of birds through these celestial zones conveyed messages from the gods. Every rustle of feathers, every call, was part of a divine language. And they didn't stop there. Lightning, eclipses, strange births, comets, all were signs. The Etruscans saw the world as a living text, constantly being written by forces greater than themselves. Their religion wasn't static, it was dynamic, responsive, investigative. But what did they believe exactly? They believed in a pantheon of deities, many of which would later be absorbed or renamed by the Romans. Some were familiar, Tinia, their version of Jupiter, Uni, a powerful goddess later equated with Juno. Others were uniquely Etruscan, like Aita, a grim god of the underworld who wore a terrifying wolf mask. And yet the Etruscans didn't build massive temples like the Greeks, nor did they leave behind mythological poems like the Iliad. Their religious life was intimate, civic, and practical. Rituals were precise, omens were analyzed, the future was not left to chance. Even Rome, conqueror of Etruria, didn't discard this system, they adopted it. In fact, during times of crisis, the Roman Senate would summon Etruscan haruspices to interpret signs and advise action. That's how respected their system was. Etruscan religion wasn't crushed, it was integrated into the bones of the Republic. In a world teetering between fate and free will, the Etruscans walked a third path, reading the signs and acting wisely. Not blind faith, not blind reason, but interpretation. They believed life was a message from the gods, and they spent their lives learning to read it.